All right, everybody, hello and welcome to another episode of The Nostalgia Trap. I am your host, David Parsons. Let's do this. I'm excited about today's show. My guest is Brooke Newman. She's a professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University and the author of an incredible book that everybody who listens to this show should go purchase and read and think about, because the ideas she's playing with and the ideas she's laying out are, I think, really important in understanding what's going on now. Her book is called A Dark Inheritance: Blood, Race, and Sex in Colonial Jamaica. We don't usually talk about colonial Jamaican history on this show, but Professor Newman's work is kind of unbelievable, and I think it fills in a piece of the puzzle for Nostalgia Trap listeners to kind of understand the construction of race. That's a concept that I think a lot of people struggle with. If you haven't maybe been to graduate school or had it, explained to you in a class or read books about it, it's difficult for many people to understand how artificial race is and how it's been constructed over the last several hundred years within the context of colonialism and imperialism and all sorts of nasty ideologies that basically designed race and racism as a method of control. And that story is one that's a big, long story. But one piece of it, and an important piece of it, is colonial Jamaica. So this conversation with Brooke Newman really opened my eyes to a lot of ideas. You can tell that I'm an American historian in this conversation, because I have a lot of questions. I really want to kind of get the lay of the land. So I think that she does a really fantastic job of explaining why this stuff matters and why it's important that in colonial Jamaica you had all these different kinds of ideologies being formed around race, around class, around gender and sex, and it's just a really fascinating story. I mean, I felt like the original impulse of history geekdom listening to her in this episode, but also, I felt like this stuff really connects with all of our other ideas that we've batted around on the Nostalgia Trap. So I hope you enjoy this episode. I wanted to make you aware that there are more Nostalgia Trap episodes. In fact, more than 100 episodes that you can find at nostalgiatrap.com. We also have bonus episodes. We put one up last week that is only for subscribers. So if you want to subscribe to the show, you can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And if you've already subscribed to the show, you should know there's a bonus episode up last week in which me and Justin Rogers Cooper talk about mass shootings and try to connect them to climate change. And we do that by kind of using this concept of from George Carlin, in which he says, they don't care about you, which is the title of the episode. So go check out They Don't Care About You, episode 124, for subscribers only at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And if you haven't subscribed, please think about it. We need you. We need you on the team. These conversations, I feel like, are conversations you can't get anywhere else. The podcast world is really exciting to me. I know there are just tons of podcasts out there, and I think that's great. I think there can't be enough, honestly. But in terms of the left and in terms of the political project we're a part of, the Nostalgia Trap is, I see our role as we're the historians. We're the ones that are trying to kind of track the big changes and put them in the context of the history we study and help people understand that. So if that's a valuable thing to you, and I hope it is, check out patreon.com/nostalgiatrap and think about becoming a supporter of the show. For $5 a month, you get access to all our episodes, and better than that, you support the kinds of voices that you hear on the show. And so let's get to one of those voices now. Here is my conversation with Professor Brooke Newman, author of Dark Inheritance: Blood, Race, and Sex in Colonial Jamaica. Okay, well, Brooke, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. We've been talking on the show a lot lately about I don't know. I was on a podcast recently about the Vietnam War, which is what I study mostly, and the host was asking me a lot of questions about colonialism and about what it was like in Vietnam during the era of French colonialism. And I realized that I had a lot to say about kind of the political arrangements of that, but felt like I was missing a lot of language. And so I'm so happy to talk to someone that has a kind of perspective on the colonized and imperial worlds and what all that means. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's weird. We live in your book is called Dark Inheritance, and it's about the particular colonial history of Jamaica and a particular element of the racial history of Jamaica. How did How did Jamaica become a subject that you became interested in, or was it the colonial element that interested you first?
Great question. People always ask me that because I don't have any, obvious ties to Jamaica or to the Caribbean kind of generally. And I would say that my interest started not really with Jamaica specifically as, really fascinated by Jamaica. It was that I started off really interested in imperialism and colonialism. And also while I was in grad school, that was when there was this huge explosion of interest in Atlantic history, which, as an undergrad, I had never even heard of. Like nobody ever said to me, hey, have you heard of Atlantic history? It was just not a thing when I was an undergrad. I had heard of imperial history, but it wasn't really something that I was exposed to very much because I went to a state school. A lot of the classes were sort of bread and butter. I think I took a class labor history. I took a class on Tudor Stuart history, Western Civ, basic stuff. And in some of the classes, there'd be like little units about women or race or something. And then sometimes we wouldn't even get to those topics. The professors would say, oh, sorry, we ran out of time. And I always felt really ripped off about that stuff.
Were you a history major as an undergrad?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was actually a double major in English and history. And I wasn't really sure as a major which one I wanted to pursue initially. But over time, I decided that I was really drawn to the contextual aspect of history. I loved reading texts and really digging into them, which is what you do in English classes. But I also really enjoyed understanding how to situate those texts, in the larger social, cultural, political, legal world. And so that's what I wanted to do as a grad student. But when I went to grad school, I still hadn't quite gotten to where I am now in terms of focusing on, empire, Atlantic history, Jamaica, all that stuff. I was trained kind of initially as someone who was working on, early modern Europe with an interest specifically in Britain, and then also, some interest in colonial America. But I grew up in Texas, and I had this kind of classic education in Texas that was all about the Alamo and, Sam Houston and some other stuff. And I was so bored with all that. I did not want to study that anymore. So when I went to grad school, I was going to, in theory, write a dissertation about masculinity and violence. And that's kind of what I was drawn to. And I was really into gender history. So I knew I wanted to do something about gender, but I wasn't sure what exactly. And then as time went on, as I mentioned earlier, that's when I started to read more about Atlantic history and imperial history. And I started to realize that there was all of these stories that needed to be told. And so much I didn't know. I mean, that's really what drew me to the Caribbean specifically, was that I felt like here's this crucial region that we've really forgotten about. And I think, things have changed since I was in grad school. I mean, now a lot of people are working on the Caribbean, and even people who started off narrowly focused on colonial America are writing second and third books looking at, Jamaica and all of these other places. So, but when I was in grad school, it felt like this frontier that, not a lot of people were into. And so I came in one day and told my dissertation advisor, who was actually a British historian, not someone who works on slavery, not someone who works on race or anything. And I just said, I've found the topic that I really want to write about. And she's like, go for it. If that's what you want to do. You've got to follow your passion, which, I think is what makes for a great advisor. Yeah.
The ones the ones that are able to kind of contain those passions in some ways and show you a path. But you said so much there. There's a couple things that I just want to pause on. First of all, your interest in masculinity and violence and that kind of thing. It seems like it would match up well with ideas of colonialism and the history of empire, but also I don't know, the masculinity and violence that comes up a lot on the show. We talk about mass shootings, we talk about all sorts of stuff with gender and those connections. What were those connections for you? Because I can very easily say, I'm interested in masculinity and violence because I was surrounded by really, macho guys growing up, and it kind of like formed my kind of ideas about manhood, and that really stuck with me and began to kind of, as I got older, it became something that I wanted to study as a like root in scholarship. But how did you come to masculinity and violence as a concern?
Probably, I mean, I'm sure growing up in Texas helped.
Yeah.
I mean, I was surrounded by, archetypes of dominant males. Very white, of course, where I lived. I mean, I grew up in the suburbs in Houston. I wouldn't say my dad is someone you would see as very masculine in a lot of ways. He's more of like a soft, cuddly sort of guy, definitely not violent. But I was surrounded by people who owned guns. Everybody that I knew, their dad had weapons. I mean, I saw tons of guns in high school. It was sort of the norm growing up. I mean, even in the suburbs, bizarrely, in a place like Houston, where I was. And then in grad school, as an undergrad, but then also in grad school, the more I learned about so many of the problems of the world, it seemed to kind of have this root in masculinity and definitions of masculinity, and how, even when they change in different spaces, power is at the heart of so many problems, in the past, now, I'm sure will be in the future. And also in the way even that all of these courses were constructed, it was all about like great men doing great things. I mean, even the way the American Revolution was taught, or the history of slavery. I mean, I hardly read anything about women doing much of anything at all. And so I think it took me a little bit of time, I think, as a grad student, to break away from even some of my initial ideas about the fact that this is all just sort of a masculine history. And if I wanted to, get at the experiences of women, including enslaved women, I could still use the sources that all of these men had left behind, but I'd have to, think about them in a new way. And that's something I tried to do.
I wondered if there were ever teachers, I don't know. I was lucky to be in Southern California. I had a bunch of hippie teachers, including like a kind of like archetypal, feminists from the 1960s who wore Birkenstocks, and kind of like, blew my mind very early that there was this kind of other history. You didn't have any of those kinds of professors or teachers as you were growing up?
Not really.
Yeah.
I mean, I would not say that I did as... not in Texas. I mean, I went to grad school in California. So speaking of Southern California, that is what really changed me intellectually, I would say.
Where in California did you go to grad school?
UC Davis.
Yeah.
And actually what's funny is that my advisor, Deb Harkness, she left, went to USC, and while I was writing my dissertation, and then went on to become a kind of international sensation. She wrote the series Discovery of Witches. Have you heard of it?
No, she wrote it.
Yeah, so she's produced a show. So it's a show now. They're going to be filming a second season. Like, she's become a big superstar.
Wow.
And it's pretty amazing. And one of my favorite stories to tell about her, and I think she would crack up if she heard me tell the story. She may not even remember this. We had like our first meeting about, what do you want to write your dissertation on? And she said, I'm really flexible. What interests you? And then she said, but wait, one disclaimer. As long as it's not about witches, because that is so done. Wow. And I was like, don't worry, I'm not going to work on witches. And then years later, I find out she's written all of these novels about witches.
Wow, that's how you cash out in academia, I think.
Yeah.
Like you can use those skills to write a book or a screenplay that hits with the mainstream crowd. That's you're made. I think that's the alt act. Like that's the alternate act. Yeah, in a lot of ways. Right. I mean, I'm kind of being sarcastic, but kind of not. Like, I feel like there are a lot of stories that we could tell as historians that need to be told, and that's the kind of like a great delivery system for that stuff.
Well, she waited until she'd already written a couple books and became a full professor, right. And then she went off and wrote this series, which is actually based on, things she knows about Elizabethan England. They travel back in time. She just came out with a recent novel called Time's Convert, which is set in the American West, during the 18th century. And she told me every time she writes one of these novels, she becomes basically a grad student of whatever that topic is, even though it's a supernatural story.
God, that's so cool. What am I doing with my life? Yeah,
exactly. But she told me early on, in terms of, pick what you want to pick. But the other thing she told me is, go where the evidence leads you.
Yeah.
And I think that's the one piece of advice from grad school that I still, keep that at heart and tell, even undergrads that it's really easy to come in to any kind of project and think like you already know what you're going to argue and you're just going to kind of cherry pick your sources and be like, I'm done, and I think that in some ways the grad programs are set up to encourage that a little bit because you only have so much time. And people that I knew, I came straight from a BA into a PhD program, and it was challenging, at first. And a lot of the other people in my program already had master's degrees. They'd already written a master's thesis, and then they went on and wrote an extension of that as a dissertation. And so their entire, 10 years or so of their life was this one topic, and they became like the expert on that one thing. Whereas I was kind of all over the place. I was interested in this and that and whatever. And I was really just sort of trying to find, what intrigues me. What do I want to sit in a corner thinking about by myself, sobbing into my tea or whatever for years on end. What's going to fascinate me? And my dissertation was about the Caribbean, but it was actually looking at a lot of islands. So I looked at the development of slave laws in, Barbados, Jamaica, and the Leeward Islands. And then I also compared that to basically ideas about masterless men, to use a phrase you're familiar with, in Tudor Stuart England, and looked at the development of vagrancy laws, and basically ideas about how to police populations and keep them under control. And so that's what I wrote about initially. And it was an interesting dissertation, but I also, when it was done, just sort of saw it more as an entry point rather than I'm going to sit down and just crank this out as a book. I really felt like I had only scratched the surface. And I wanted to delve more deeply into one place and really understand the local context. But it took me a couple of years to think that. I had some fellowships that I was fortunate to get, which kind of helped me cobble together, a career path after grad school. And I had a fellowship at the John Carter Brown Library for an academic year, which was amazing. And I would meet people and they would say, what are you working on? And I was like, well, I'm doing this and that. And I finally was like, okay, I just need to pick something and just put all my eggs in that basket. And I sat down and made a list of what are the different regions that I'm interested in. And then I realized Jamaica was just clearly the right choice because it was the wealthiest colony in the 18th century by the mid 18th century. It was the largest. It had the largest slave population. It was the largest producer of export crops. So, sugar, rum, molasses, all that stuff. But it also had this growing population of free people who were descended from slaves. And some of these free people were classified as free blacks, and some were classified as mulattoes or free people of color. But I was really drawn to the fact that this group existed in Jamaica and that there were all of these laws passed about this group. And then I was able to find, petitions submitted by this group. And that, I think, is kind of what sealed the deal for me, that you had this really important colony, but also all of these things happening at the local level that made this colony fascinating, but also somewhat unique. And this laboratory of colonialism and slavery and race and gender and sexuality and everything I was interested in, kind of all in one. And so that's really what pushed me in that direction. And I also followed the evidence. There's a lot of evidence about Jamaica.
Yeah, the subtitle of your book is Blood, Race, and Sex in Colonial Jamaica, and it sounds like it's containing all of those things that you're kind of aiming at there. But I wanted to kind of take that apart a little bit because it's such a the story you're telling, it seems like is a really great entry point for people to understand concepts of race and how concepts of whiteness have have shifted over time. I think that's a hard concept for people to understand. Like
Yes.
when people hear that, the Irish weren't white at some point in American history, they kind of, a lot of students especially are kind of like, what? I don't understand how that works, because they are associating it with kind of like skin color. But how are all those kinds of different levels of whiteness and blackness being, to me, it's like kind of like, how does a society work when you've got all of those different, in other words, how do they know, like how do they know who's who, and how do they divide their society that way?
Yeah, great question. So when I started this project years ago, I knew that, because people had already written about this before, but there'd been all this discussion of, in the 17th century, in the late 17th century, ideas of race are developing. And you really see that in the laws passed in places like Barbados and Jamaica, because they shift, the language of the laws shift, and they start specifically talking about whiteness and white people by, the end of the 17th century. And it's the same in Jamaica. But the thing that struck me in a kind of dweeby legal history way is that they hadn't actually defined what whiteness was. It was just assumed, that you knew what it was,
right,
and that you could sort everyone out. And so the groups were divided between things like mulatto, and imagine I'm making air quotes around all these things too, like
sure,
mulatto,
yeah, mm-hmm,
so-called Negro, Indian, all this stuff. And I, at the time, I kept thinking, none of these things have really been defined. This is all a kind of customary understanding of what this means. But in the 18th century, all of that begins to change when members of these basically subgroups start trying to get the same rights as the white settlers. They want to vote in elections. They do not want to have to go to court, go to slave courts. They want to be able to testify in court. They want to be able to protect their property. They want access to the things that white settlers have access to. And this leads to basically a legislative backlash where people in the assembly get together. And, I looked at the notes of the assembly. And so when I say they get together, it really does seem as though they're sitting around kind of talking about this because they're having conversations. And the record shows, like, you don't see this in the final version of the laws, whether they're in manuscript or published, but you do see it in the notes of the assembly. And they'll say stuff like, well, let's make it to where, no mulattoes are allowed to vote, and no mulattoes can be elected to any kind of position of public trust. But at the same time, somebody then says, well, how do we define mulatto? Well, how do we define that? And they have a discussion, and they're like, well, they need to be several generations removed from the Negro ancestor. Right. And then they actually talk about it in terms of blood. They talk about how far, this was the quote that kind of put me over the edge. They say, how far should the corruption of blood extend? And that kind of gave me chills, when I read that. I was like, wow, because that is not. So
there's like a point. There's like a point in like generational biological history that a person would become white. In other words, their blood would be diluted enough to become white.
Yes, and that's what they're talking about here. And of course, what they mean always is that white men enable this to happen. Right. So it's never a white woman and, a man of African descent, and that this is something that can happen over time. It's only through kind of masculinity and the kind of power of white male blood that this can happen over time. But it's also all an informal process because these are not happening in legitimate marital relationships. This is all illicit. And so a lot of it is very, arbitrary, honestly. Like when you find the notes that they've left, they're using phrases like corruption of blood. They're talking about, so-called Negro ancestors and how much time needs to go by. But by doing that, they're also defining what whiteness is. And they're saying that whiteness is something that can be attained legally. But it's not that easy. And I think that if you look at this stuff and you think, wow, this is amazing, they're making it sound as though anybody can become white, and then they can have all these rights. And that's what it looks like kind of initially. And Winthrop Jordan, he wrote this article decades ago where he talked about how Jamaica is this amazing place because only there, I think he even says something like, only there can a Negro become a white man. And that is what drew me initially to this. Like, is it that simple? But it's not that simple at all, because the point of all of this is that you take people who were, let's say, trying to pass as white and maybe socially are kind of treated as white based on, property or other qualifications. But now there's a law, and you have to be able to show, basically, that you have inherited this certain status. And also you can't, there's another element to this too. You have to be baptized. You have to be Christian, Protestant Christian. And so that is another key part of this. Religion is embedded in these racial distinctions from the very beginning. And so it's not something that you can just, pass as white and go vote. People would know, who are you? And in fact, there's multiple reports of people trying to vote in Jamaica, people who were mulatto, legally considered mulatto, or people who were Jewish who were trying to vote and saying, well, why can't I vote? And they weren't considered equal in any way.
So it's fascinating to me that you see in Jamaica, in colonial Jamaica, this idea of whiteness as a legal category and as a religious category, because it seems like it's something that obviously becomes a kind of dominant ideology through the rest of history. Is this defining whiteness as a particular set of rights, and then using that to kind of define who gets it and who doesn't.
Right, and then also to make, if you essentially link rights with a racial status, with a classification like whiteness, and then you make it, vaguely possible for people to achieve it through mixture and through relationships with white men, then you also create the sort of perfect conditions to allow for these relationships to flourish. Right. These illicit relationships. And a lot of people who went to Jamaica in the 18th century talked about this, about how, in Jamaica, you've got all of these relationships between free women of color and white men. And they're never legally sanctified relationships. They're always, illicit. I mean, it's very rare that you find people who were married. And that's also in the sources too. They talk quite a bit about how, nobody would dare to marry somebody of African blood because it would degrade their family line, and their legitimate family line. And so some of the men that I've studied in this project, they've got illegitimate children with various women in Jamaica, and some of whom, they go on and they actually will leave money to them, or they will pay for them to be educated, and it looks all like, oh wow, look at them, look at all the stuff they've done. But then they leave and they go back to Britain and they marry, British women, and they have legitimate families, and they in some ways kind of cast aside that aspect of their life. Where they've had these relationships, they've had these illicit mixed race children, and they've done the kind of customary thing of maybe leaving them something or freeing them, but that's it. There's only so far that they're going to go. And I think people can argue about this, and there will be, I think, in the future multiple interpretations of this in terms of like the actions of these men. But I see it very much as this is an exercise of power in a slave society. And even if these men, emancipate their children who are mixed race, or if they leave them some money, or if they even send them to Scotland to be educated in some sort of obscure boarding school, it doesn't necessarily mean, what we in the 20th or 21st century might think that it means. We can look back and say like, oh, this must have been an affectionate relationship. Look what he did. But I think that that's, really misconstruing what's going on here. This is about power. And it's also about status. If you were of a certain status, this is what you did. people who were overseers. I mean, I don't know if you've heard of Thomas Thistlewood. He's
no.
He's a kind of infamous overseer who was known to have had, sexual relationships, mostly coerced, with hundreds and hundreds of enslaved women in Jamaica. And Trevor Bernard has written a whole book about this, about how he had a diary and he actually recorded every sex act. So we know that he had hundreds and hundreds of sexual encounters, right, with these women. And he was an overseer.
Why was he recording those sex acts? Is it something like it was just like for the illicit pleasure of it, or was there some like larger purpose? Do we know?
Yeah, that's a good question.
That's just an insane detail.
Right. I mean, and that's one of the reasons why there's only so many people you can hold up as an example, like Thomas Thistlewood.
Right.
Because most people are not, recording all of these things. And he also, he developed like a code to talk about this as well. So, I mean, he's just a sort of fascinating character.
Yeah.
But I also looked at the diary and I wrote an article on this guy. So he was a physician. He was a Scottish physician named Jonathan Troop, and he went to Dominica, and he recorded a few instances of, illicit sexual encounters that he had. And then he also talked a lot about gonorrhea and like venereal diseases that so many of the men had through these encounters. And then by the end of his diary, he's somewhat negative about this. Like he starts to kind of feel as though he himself has succumbed to this sort of tropical environment.
Oh, that's a common story in the colonial world, right? Right, is the kind of like idea of like the heart of darkness idea or something, where you're going to be like, don't go too far into the world of the indigenous, because you might catch something of their darkness, whatever that means.
Right, and there's. In a place like Jamaica,
old racist ideas, I guess I got to make sure.
There were two threats. One was mortality, because the death rate was extremely high, and the other one was immorality. Either you would die young, or you would in some way imperil yourself, your morality, your bloodline, the white race, all of that sort of stuff. And that's something that, when I started this project, I knew that, these ideas were out there, ideas about concerns about race and race mixture. But I hadn't quite understood, how did what was happening on the ground in everyday life in a place like Jamaica actually influence people's understandings of race in Britain. And that's actually what I end up talking about in the book.
I was wondering how this is all being taken in Britain, because it seems like it's, the story you're telling is a story, of one in which, white men are going to, colonize this island, Jamaica, and in doing so, they're having sex with the women there, and they're having children with them, and it's actually something that's become such a phenomenon that they're writing about it and making laws about it. So how is that being taken in British society? Because it seems like it contradicts, in some ways, the kind of benevolent ideology of colonialism, which is supposed to be about, something good happening and Christianity, etc. It seems like in that kind of Victorian culture, sexuality was so restricted. It seems like people would be upset about this.
Well, this is what the abolitionists essentially use to help bolster their campaign in the late 18th and early 19th century. I mean, they very explicitly attack slaveholders and other people who have power over the enslaved and who engage in these relationships. And they say, you're supposed to be upholding this example of benevolent mastery, Christian mastery, and instead you're abusing your power. And you are, degrading the British Empire, and you're imperiling the colony. And by creating all of these people who are of mixed racial ancestry, you're also creating a population that might rebel, which is what happened, in Saint-Domingue and led to the creation of Haiti. And so there's all of this anxiety about what is going to happen in a place like Jamaica or in the British Caribbean as a whole, especially after the American Revolution. They've already lost this huge, crucial part of the British Atlantic Empire. And then the other islands that are there are full of enslaved people. And there's examples of now successful slave revolts. And so the abolitionists essentially argue that unless the slave trade ends and everyone kind of changes their practices on the ground, then it's inevitable that there'll be a huge revolution or something horrible will happen. And, this whole society will collapse and all the money will be lost. And not to mention the fact that people who are of mixed ancestry are going to inherit property and eventually come back to Britain and basically infiltrate the nation and marry white people. And that's something that I talk about in the last couple chapters of my book, because I kind of shift focus to Britain in the book, because I think it's so important to show how this plays out, in the metropole. And I have a whole chapter looking at satirical prints and pop culture and things like that. People are really concerned about racial mixture, and also about how what's happening, as they see it as kind of on the fringes of the empire, is actually affecting people at home and could possibly lead to further racial mixture in Britain. And there's these, amazing satirical prints that are published in this period, because this is the period when caricature becomes, extremely popular. Everybody is, people are buying these prints. They're everywhere. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of them. Only some of them include, Black characters, but they're very subversive, the ones that do. I mean, there's even images of members of the royal family in compromising situations involving enslaved women. And, these are the sorts of things that would have really shocked people at the time.
Do we have any idea who were creating those subversive ones? Are they're like other anti-imperialists in British society, and where are they?
No, these are definitely not anti-imperialists. These are people who were trying to make money. They're trying, these are people who are trying. They're print sellers who are.
That sounds familiar too.
Yeah, exactly. They're well known for catering to a certain kind of mostly male clientele, and a lot. I mean, there's a whole subset of these caricatures that are focused on things like flagellation. I mean, they're very pornographic, a lot of them.
I can see that, yeah.
A lot of body humor, there's a lot of them about government ministers, the royal family, any kind of social figure that you want to lampoon or political figure. But if you then insert into that a Black woman, it just sort of increases the subversiveness of the whole thing, and also the titillation of it. I mean, a number of these caricatures show white men with a candle in a dark room, and their face shows shock, and they're looking at half-naked Black woman lying in a bed, and she's usually smiling, kind of with relish. And that really, when I found a lot of these prints, I was like, what the hell is going on here? I mean, because they're so obviously what we would now say, incredibly racist, sexist images, but were also really powerful. And I wanted to see how they were connected to what I was studying, in Jamaica.
Yeah, when you say that, I've heard arguments made about those kind of, what are the meaning of those images and how are they interpreted? And a lot of people have a lot of different ideas about that. I was wondering what you're thinking about that, because it seems some people some people have argued that those images, like even minstrel images, like there's some kind of lurid fascination that's kind of playing off the Victorian culture that white people are kind of trapped by, and they're looking to the exotic as some sort of, like, I don't know, escape route or something different from what they're experiencing.
Well, one thing to keep in mind is this is pre-Victorian culture, really, that we're talking about the Georgian period, which was incredibly raunchy. Once you get to the true Victorian era, like the mid 19th century, a lot of these caricatures fall out of fashion.
Okay, that's good. That's good for me to know. I was totally out of my ear there.
Yeah, and even the abolitionists, they were made fun of at the time. They were seen as being just prudes. Yeah. One of my favorite caricatures has William Wilberforce putting a leaf over a classical statue to cover up, the genitalia, because he's embarrassed. And, it's all about how they're not just concerned about enslaved people. They want all of society to be reformed. They want everyone to be more moral, more Christian, more monogamous, because, adultery was rampant in Britain in this period too. And so even though, you can think that there's all of these sexual relationships happening in the colonies, well, they're happening in Britain too. I mean, all of the members of the royal family, many of George III's sons had mistresses, and everyone knew. It was an open secret. The future William IV, who was the third son of George III, he lived for years with his mistress, and she had multiple children by him. And he features pretty prominently as the Duke of Clarence in a number of these caricatures. And I actually talk about him in my book because he is the only member of the royal family who served in the Navy and actually was, out and about in the Atlantic world. He visited New York. There was a plot by George Washington to potentially kidnap him when he was in New York. Yeah, but he ended up, finding out about this plot, and it was foiled, and they kind of abandoned it. He also visited the Caribbean islands, and he saw slavery firsthand. And he also, according to rumors, engaged in sexual relationships with enslaved women. And I have seen his letters, and I know that he contracted venereal disease while he was in the Caribbean.
Wow.
And this is a member of the royal family.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the Jamaica and the Caribbean as this, this place that men are using as this kind of like, sex tourism in some way, but it's also existing. And it seems like it's something that you're touching on in your book, is that you're looking at the real history of Jamaica, but also the kind of Jamaica in the historical imagination in Britain. Is that true?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, and that's actually one of the reasons why I was fascinated by Jamaica, and still fascinated by Jamaica, is that Jamaica, it plays such a prominent role in the popular imagination in London, in Britain in the 18th and early 19th centuries. So if you go back to the 17th century, a lot of focus is on Barbados. Barbados was this really, really important colony for such a long time, but by the late 18th century, it's Jamaica. I mean, Jamaica is everywhere in plays, novels, prints, in these satirical prints. People associate Jamaica with slavery, with wealth, with power, because a lot of the members of the Society of West India Merchants and Planters, which is the West Indian lobby, are from Jamaica, and the Jamaicans have the largest voice. And even during the abolition debate, people would say things like, well, we just need to convince Parliament that Jamaica will be impacted if we end the slave trade, or that there'll be a massive revolt in Jamaica, because they're not going to gamble with the prospect of losing Jamaica. And so Jamaica is everywhere. You just really see it, people talking about Jamaica, thinking about Jamaica, and also laughing about Jamaica. And I think that's why I put a chapter in my book about laughter, because I think that sometimes, this is all deadly serious stuff, slavery and race and all the rest of it. But it's also pretty shocking to realize how often they joked about slavery and race and sexual exploitation. This is a really crude time. And I think if you don't see that, it's easy to get kind of wrapped up in thinking like, oh, there's all of these anxieties about whiteness and racial mixture. Well, there were, but they also thought it was funny.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I tried to do in my book, and I'm actually continuing to work on this topic still, is to sort of see where the boundary between genuine concern and fear and anxiety slips into, laughter, to the point where you're laughing either because you don't think it's that big of a deal, or you're laughing in kind of in a nervous way. And I think that
there's definite deep psychology to that stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that if you just even study the print culture of the period, it seems fairly clear that the closer you get to emancipation, full emancipation, the more the laughter becomes much more of an anxious kind of laughter, where it starts to seem more real, that, it's possible that these people could be free and could migrate to Britain and transform the nation. And ultimately that's what immigrants do in Britain and everywhere else. And you see even now in Britain, this real concern about what has happened to Britain.
Racist conservatives like to post pictures of British streets with Indian restaurants on them and say, look what has happened to London, and you're like, are you fucking kidding me? It's insane.
Yeah, so these concerns have been there for a long time.
Yeah.
The one other thing I think that I like to mention is that so a lot of people talk about purity, and as though it was some actual real state that you could achieve. And one of the things that I realized while writing this book, and I hope I argue in this book and make clear, is that purity is seen very much as it's about kind of mixture is something that's always happening, but yet you can get to a point of sort of equilibrium where you want to stay put. And that's what you see people talking about whiteness in the 18th century. They're like, we're this mixture, we're this amalgamation of the Romans and, the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans and even like the Trojans, like some of it's mythical. But, now we're at this perfect mixture and we don't want it to change. And then when they start to mix with other groups like Africans or people from, India and other places, there's the concern is not necessarily that, we're no longer pure. It's that the mixture we've achieved and kind of where we're at is going to change.
That is incredible. Wow.
Yeah, and
so like
and
there's almost like within that ideology, that white I guess supremacist ideology, there's a kind of consciousness of already a mixing that's already occurred, and we're already at the point of that we've had enough mixing and that's it.
Exactly.
God,
yeah,
that's amazing.
And that's why, and I think that when you work on race, it's so complicated, and you really have to kind of get down into the fine-grained distinctions, thinking about these terms that they're using. Because, when they say things like corruption, what does that mean? And it changes over time what that means. And they're also thinking about corruption in terms of how other countries define this. So, among the Spanish and the Portuguese and the French, they'll even point to different examples. And like Latin America, they're always talking about Latin America in Jamaica and pointing to Brazil and other places and saying, we don't want to end up like them because they mix too much with indigenous people and they mix too much with Africans. And now look at them. And, we can't end up like that. And so that's part of this story. It's about how do you have a society that is a slave society that is demographically composed primarily of non-whites.
Wow.
And
when
yet,
when you're talking about the people that are forming this ideology and writing this stuff that you're looking at, is it primarily like people from the white ruling class that are writing this literature?
Yes. Yeah. And there's people within the context of the slave societies who are reflecting on this and writing about this. People like Edward Long and Brian Edwards and, many other people. There's also people back in Europe who are writing up these, philosophical and pseudoscientific discourses talking about race and about mixture and, the different peoples on the globe and why they are the way they are and how, if we mix together, what will happen and what could result in degenerative outcomes.
Well, our version of that is Thomas Jefferson, I guess, and people like that, or at the beginning of the American colonial project, writing about very similar stuff.
Right, and Benjamin Franklin also.
Oh yeah, Ben Franklin, huge one. Franklin's autobiography is nuts. I had it assigned. It was an assigned reading when I was an adjunct at a school many years ago, and it was an assigned reading. And I don't usually teach colonial history. And we were supposed to read autobiography of Ben Franklin, so it'd been a long time since I looked at it, and it's a mind blowing. It's like reading American Psycho. It's like those guys were nuts, and it seems like I kind of was interested in the class element of it, and kind of like who are the people that are writing that stuff.
Yeah, and Benjamin Franklin even has this line where he says, there's very few true white people on the planet, and so they have to be protected. And so
it's insane.
The white supremacy has been with us for centuries,
yeah,
and it's manifested in different ways.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would be tempted to think of, Jamaica. Just to get back to Jamaica really quickly, is like a lot of people would be tempted to think about Jamaica as kind of like or even just the small island nations that the British Empire colonized as kind of a side story in British history. But it seems like what your book is arguing is that places like Jamaica were kind of central in defining a British identity in this point in time, and something that's going to have a long, long legacy.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. God, it's incredible work.
Thank you.
Yeah. I have so many other questions. I mean, the idea about like blood purity is amazing, and like the ancestry.com is really popular, right now. And I wonder what you think about all that stuff, because Elizabeth Warren and the Pocahontas stuff, was that driving you crazy in the news? You must have had some sort of perspective on that.
Oh yeah, I mean, my initial response to that was she played right into Trump's hand, and I can't believe she did that. I see why she did that, but she's reducing Native American identity to a test that you can take, and it just doesn't work that way. And it's also about Native American communities. They want to define who gets to be a member of their community. These are sovereign groups. Yeah. And by taking a blood test, and saying, see, I have this genetic link, she's, severing all of these crucial connections like kinship networks and, basically understandings of sovereignty among Native Americans, and in a way that most people, the majority of people in America, would never understand. Yeah. And so a lot of Native Americans were, deeply offended by Elizabeth Warren doing this, even though she tries to position herself as an advocate or as a potential ally, but she went about it in a really sloppy way. And in a way, I think that, reaffirms a lot of these 18th century ideas about blood that are very disturbing. Mm-hmm. And it's like blood is used in all of these ways to as a kind of benchmark to say, you're this or you're that. Or you're owed certain things. And it's also, I think, it's a fungible concept at the same time that it seems sort of like biology, as though you can kind of pin it down and say, this is the bloodline. And I think that's why blood is something that pops up in a variety of colonial spaces. And even now, I mean, white supremacists talk about blood too. Yeah.
That's why it's weird to be like at the gym and I see these ancestry.com commercials come up that are like, people are finding out their exact percentage of their DNA. And it seems like a weird, and maybe not so weird, but like dangerous kind of cultural phenomenon to have people thinking in those ways. I mean, I always think about the worst elements of our history, from the stuff you're talking about in Jamaica and imperialism, but also eugenics and and Nazis and every other kind of awful racist kind of reality we've lived through.
Yeah, blood has played a crucial role in all of these issues, in the eugenics movement, and also blood as a form of pseudoscience. Yeah. I mean, even in the eugenics movement, there are like all of these people thinking, this is the future. We're going to be able to eradicate disability and, create these perfect humans. And then over time, they discovered that they know virtually nothing about genetics. They don't even really understand it. Mm. And so, and I mean, if looking back into the period that I work on, you can see that lineage there, that, you can point to certain things like blood, because it seems as though it's a marker that is hard to manipulate, but it's actually really easy to manipulate.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there's also, I mean, if it's not blood, it's the shape of skulls and all sorts of other kind of biological factors. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to use something like blood, a concept like blood, to prove whiteness, because whiteness itself is an unstable category. I mean, the more you try to define it, the harder it is.
Yeah. I always try to challenge students about that, because many, I think people, and I say people, I mean students, I mean just ordinary Americans tend to think of whiteness as the same way like the Supreme Court justice defined pornography, like I know it when I see it kind of thing. But that seems like
exactly.
If we're gonna have a society that is really kind of rigidly structured around race, whether we admit it or not, it seems like we ought to be able to define whiteness, but we can't. And it seems like that's a That's a really critical fact at the heart of the whole project.
Yes, and then there's also the cases you hear about on occasion of people who are white or of European ancestry trying to pass as Black, and this always causes an uproar. And I think rightly so, because even though whiteness, cannot really be defined, there's still privileges attached to it.
Yeah.
And, that I think is what's so important, is that at the same time that I think, whiteness is something that is used to help create categories and to deny people rights, it in and of itself may not have any intrinsic meaning or any biological meaning, but it still has profound impacts on people's lives. Both, in the 18th century and
real.
now.
Yeah, I'm a white male, and I've definitely benefited from being a white male. And I don't know exactly how to categorize that or quantify it, but I know it's true.
Right. I know.
And that's a tricky thing to kind of think about. It
is. And, I started off not interested in race. I'm talking about back when I was like an undergrad. I was more interested in gender. And it was only through time that I started to really comprehend my own racial privilege as, a white woman growing up in Texas. And my family was very conservative, still are. They're very religious. And so I was kind of just trying to work my way out of that.
Right,
at a young age. And my dad used to listen to Rush Limbaugh in the car, and we'd be driving around, and I would be like, "What is a feminazi?" I'd ask him these questions, and he would explain to me all of this stuff. So I was really, highly conscious of what I saw as gender disparities and things that were more difficult for me, as a woman. But it was my white privilege that enabled me to not think that much about race. Until I went to grad school, and until I kind of got out of my world that I had grown up in, and started to think more broadly about inequality, structural inequality and power, and seeing it play out in these colonial spaces, and seeing how much race mattered to people who were creating these laws, because of course they want to maintain their power and their privilege, and then how the people who were racially classified in a kind of inferior racial status, and how they were subject to legal disabilities and things like that, how they responded to that, and how they tried to articulate like a counter argument. And that is what I talk about in my book. And it's really, I think, the focus of my work is about inequality, but it's also about how categorizing groups, creating types of people, how that lends itself to creating a stratified society. That very much like the society we're in now, where you have, the top 1% controlling power and wealth, very similar to a place like Jamaica in the 18th century. Very different, but still similar in a lot of ways.
Totally, and it feels like, and it feels really hard to overcome. It doesn't seem like those categorizations are. It seems like they're going to be around a long time, but it seems like that it would also be possible to create a society that didn't kind of exploit that, if that makes sense.
Yes, but I'm not surprised that most of the hashtags now are like resistance, because it seems as though the only way to undo some of this stuff that's been around for centuries is through upheaval and rupture, and because people are trying to work within the system. And luckily, with our recent election, hopefully we'll be able to slowly chip away at some of these inequalities, but they benefit really wealthy and powerful people. It's to their benefit not to do recounts, not to expand the vote. And, that's one of the things that I talk about in my book, is that, they don't want people who are descended from the enslaved to have a say in a slave society, or even in a formerly slave society, because those people are going to want to have more access to opportunities that the white privileged elites want to keep for themselves and for their children and their descendants.
Yeah. I wondered if you had any thoughts on Jamaica in the American imagination, because I come from, well, you came to UC Davis, so California culture a little bit. I'm in Southern California, where we still have like white people at like white bars where only white people go is like reggae night, like a few times a week. Like it's this weird kind of engagement with Jamaica and I guess like vaguely tropical culture. But like I don't know, the Bob Marley album Legend is like, you know, frat boy heaven. I don't know if it still is, but like I went to UC Santa Barbara and that was just, you know, the soundtrack of that place. And it's a weird kind of engagement with Jamaica. Have you encountered that in your life?
Yes. I mean, most people that I know, unless they're in my field, know virtually nothing about Jamaica.
Yeah.
Jamaica is one of those places where a lot of people have been there on a vacation or their honeymoon, and they went to an all-inclusive resort. They didn't really see Jamaica. They didn't really talk to anybody in Jamaica. They didn't really drive around. They just, you know, were catered to and brought drinks to, and that's about it. And they listened to music. And
they
of course,
an imperial vacation.
They did. They absolutely, like, imperial tourism. And then they went, you know, maybe went back and listened to Bob Marley. And then, of course, all the frat boys who like to smoke pot have always liked the idea of Rastafarianism and the idea of Jamaica. But Jamaica is also associated with drugs, with crime. With when I did research in Kingston and then I flew back through Florida, they questioned me extensively. I mean, I think they thought I was a drug mule in Miami and I didn't get my luggage. I actually got it days later. They shipped it to me. They searched it. You know, there's a lot of anxiety around people going to Jamaica. You know, why would you possibly go there unless you want drugs? Which I think is really sad.
Yeah. But it seems like it's part of this history, though, of like how white people look at Jamaica, which is like this exotic place, whether it be sex or weed or, you know, Marley and a kind of like reggae mystique. There's something going on there that is something that white people want it's like some fantasy space or something.
Yes. Yeah. You know, a lot of people, I think of the Caribbean that way in general. And other than, oh no, there's a hurricane. Yeah. Which will, you know, I don't want to deal with that. Other than that, it's like everybody wants to go there on vacation. And, you know, it's still associated with like that picture postcard reality of I'm going to go and relax and have no worries. And, you know, the people who live there, of course, live in a completely different reality. Yeah. And on the one hand, they need all these tourists to come. But on the other hand, you know, I think they're offended and annoyed by all these tourists who don't want to engage with them. They don't want to learn about their culture or history. They just want to sort of exploit what's on offer and leave. Yeah. You know, I mean, they might as well just go to Florida. That's what I always wonder, like, why are you bothering to go all the way to Jamaica?
Well, they want that. They want that authentic. There's something authentic about that. It's like you know, it really is to me like still kind of rooted in those really racist ideas about Native people having some sort of access to magic that white people don't have. And if we can touch it, and then I mean, it's like this stuff is in Disney movies and stuff. It's really so when I think about the stuff that you write about. And thank you for talking to me for the last hour about it. It's like it seems like it's woven into the fabric of our culture, just everywhere you look.
And you know, most students want to take classes about pirates.
Yes,
that's what they're
totally.
Pirates, and it's because pirates are sexy.
Yeah.
And when I tell them,
what is a pirate?
What is a pirate? They'll tell me some stuff, and I'm like, well, let me tell you what a pirate is. They are violent. They are often rapists. Mm-hmm. They are savage, murderous thugs. A lot of them are alcoholic. I mean, there's a lot of really, really bad things about pirates, but they don't care about any of that because of Hollywood and the way there's this veneer of swashbuckling. You know, I mean, it's almost like the Wild West.
Totally. Yeah. And, exactly.
Yeah, and that's how. And that's
a really weird mythology for something that was so fucked up. Yeah, if you read Cormac McCarthy novels, you get a little bit of a sense of how fucked up the West was. But anything else is going to be like some romantic story with 6 shooters and all that romance.
Yeah, like Blood Meridian, definitely not romantic.
Yes.
The thing that's kind of fascinating is that, you know, early maps of places like Barbados showed camels and, you know, people riding horses and shooting guns. And I mean, the imagery was very much a kind of Westworld sort of thing, you know, that we would imagine now. And so for a long time, these island spaces were associated with, kind of life beyond the line, like living out. Richard Dunn talked about this years ago, like kind of living in these spaces where anything goes, where you can kind of reinvent yourself. But at the same time, indulge in all of these pleasures that, civilized society restricts you from engaging in, at least not in a way that, you can flaunt. Whereas here in these spaces, you don't have to be that religious. You don't have to pretend to be a good, upstanding person, in your day-to-day life. You can just sort of live this way. It's only when you go back to Britain that you then have to taper some of this. And so I think that's kind of fascinating and sad. Sadly, it's not surprising that these spaces are still viewed that way.
And to bring it back to your youth riding around with your father listening to Rush Limbaugh, I think Rush Limbaugh was caught at some point, smuggling sex toys down to Puerto Rico to go on a sex vacation in the Caribbean. And so, how perfect is that? Jeez,
if only I could have told my dad that at the time.
Jesus.
Turn this shit off. But instead, we had to have these, philosophical conversations about,
God.
So he told me, I remember him telling me, I'm making him look really bad right now, but this is a true story. He said to me that there were women out there who wanted to just eradicate men, and that they would, basically wish they could just sort of take over without men and all of this stuff. And the thing that I thought at the time was, who are these women and where are they? Like, where are these women? I've never seen them. I've never met them. Where are these women?
Well, I asked Frances Fox Piven this when I interviewed her a while back, and she said the answer was that they're witches. That to go back to the beginning of our conversation, that the right seems to believe in witches and thinks that women are, some sort of magical yet degraded creatures. I don't know. They have I think they have some gender issues. I'll put it that way.
This must be why I wrote my undergraduate honors thesis on witchcraft.
Yeah. I think the witch thing is overlooked in a lot of ways. Isn't there a TV show called Salem right now too?
I do know there's one. There's the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina.
That's right.
You heard of this?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's on Netflix. I think it's really a funny show. It's a fight the patriarchy sort of show, but it's one of the few shows you can watch where the people on the show say things like, praise Satan, and it's very tongue in cheek. It's a funny show. It's funny.
Well, I think that and to me, like, no matter where things are going, the engagement with gender and race has to be a big part of it, because it seems like that's and I think your book is just one of many that reminds us that stuff is at the root of a lot of our structural problems, etc. So I just one quick question before you go. What are you working on next? Do you know what project you're thinking about next?
Yes, I'm actually working on a book that's related to my first project, but expands it, and I'm looking at the involvement of the monarchy in the slave trade, in the development of an Atlantic slave system, and then in the dismantling of the Atlantic slave system in the 19th century, as Britain tried to embrace this, kind of pseudo-humanitarianism at the same time that they're expanding their empire. And they're also essentially taking liberated Africans from slave ships and then turning around and forcing them to enlist in the Navy and then sending them back to the West Indies as soldiers. Cool. So that's the next project. And I've already gone and spent a month in Windsor Castle researching this project last year. And I've been, doing a bunch of trips and stuff. But it kind of started all with those satirical prints attacking the royal family and including enslaved women in the images. And then, of course, finding little snippets in the archives where people are talking about the involvement of the royal family behind the scenes, either pro-slavery or there were also people who were abolitionists who were members of the royal family. And so there's this great story. And I hope that book will be written more for a wider audience. So I'm going to spend a lot of time really thinking about how to structure it and how to tell a story and how to let the argument unfold in a narrative way.
I think that's great. We talk about that a lot on the show, the kind of idea of how we need to package our history, even our academic historical ideas in ways that the public can digest them.
Yes, and I loved your discussion with Heather.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. Yes,
Heather Ann Thompson. Yes, when she talked about how, she had to write this massive project or put all this together, and how to think about how to let the story tell itself, and that the argument will be clear through the prose versus saying, this book argues.
Yes.
And I think that's partly what a lot of academics, what we want to do, but we're not really ready yet with our first projects, because we still need to kind of say, like, here's what I can do, and here's what I've argued, and here's what I can prove. And then after all that is done, you're like, okay, good. I've done that. Now I can kind of think a little bit more about writing something people want to read.
Yeah.
Like so-called normal people, maybe.
Yeah, and I'm really happy to see, and I don't know if this is actually true or not, but it feels like a lot of women historians are leading this kind of phenomenon. They're writing books that are just kind of like mind-blowing popular histories, and I love them.
Yeah, Erica Dunbar. There's so many different people doing this now and paving the way for the rest of us.
Well, I think that the detail you just gave, I think about kind of finding those satirical prints is such a great little detail for the young historians that are listening to this program to kind of hear from a historian that's writing really tremendously important work, that it starts with finding something that piques your interest, and finding something small that like leads you down the rabbit hole. So Brooke Newman, thank you so much for telling your story. I'm really looking forward to the rest of your work, and I really appreciate you talking with us.
Yeah, it was great talking to you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Take care. Okay, everybody, that is it for today. I want to give a big thank you to Brooke Newman for explaining all of those things to us. I had a really great time listening to her, and I hope you go check out her book, A Dark Inheritance, Blood, Race, and Sex in Colonial Jamaica, which is out now from Yale University Press. And check out all of her stuff. Follow her on Twitter, etc. She's a really exciting scholar, and we need more of these voices out there. So thanks, Brooke, for joining us. Thank you, listeners, for checking out the program. And if you want extra content and more of the crazy stuff me and Justin are talking about, think about subscribing to the show, because we got bonus episodes up right now that you can listen to at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Okay, everybody, thanks so much. We'll see you again. Take care. Bye-bye.